Is that uniform real? Or did you pull it from a Hollywood prop room?" he sneered, swinging the cuffs like a Monday morning performance, his attitude dripping with defiance. Unbeknownst to him, the woman he insulted was a military general. One phone call, and his career crumbled on the spot. A figure from the Pentagon stepped forward, removing the cuffs. "You just disrespected a symbol of national honor. This wasn't just a cop's humiliation. It was an indictment of warped power masquerading as law. Watch to the end, because some people don't need to shout to silence the system." The gray SUV pulled up beside the gas station, settling on a patch of dusty ground where not a single soul passed by. A few hundred meters away, the old shops stood mostly shut, their broken signs swaying under the sun. A soft breeze brushed through the roadside weeds, sweeping a plastic bag under the front tire. The woman stepped out. Her stance was steady, her face sun-worn. The green military uniform was buttoned neatly, its shoulder insignia catching the pale light of morning. In her hands were a pair of worn gloves, a bottle of spring water, and a creased map folded with precision. Every movement was exact and deliberate, but never showy. Two police officers leaned against the running patrol car not far away. One was bald, with broad shoulders, holding a paper coffee cup. The other was smaller, with thinning hair, eyes darting sideways. They had spotted her the moment the vehicle turned in, but when she stepped out, their gaze shifted from curious to invasive. "What's she wearing?" the bald one asked, voice low but laced with mockery. "Military gear. Where'd she dig that up?" The other shrugged, indifferent. "Looks real, but who drives up to a rural gas station in full uniform? It's like she's begging for attention." They didn't speak loudly, but made no effort to keep it private. The woman heard them. She didn't react. She placed the water bottle on the hood of her car and opened her wallet. Even in small gestures, the authority honed over years of service stayed with her. She didn't look their way, as if their words weren't worth responding to. But that very composure seemed to provoke them. "Who does she think she is?" the bald one continued, raising his voice. "A soldier? This is a gas station, not a battlefield." The other officer bowed his head, trying to stifle a laugh, then muttered, "Maybe she's an actress. Hollywood or Amazon or something?" The remark made Boone, the bald officer, snort with laughter. He pushed the car door open and stepped out, coffee still in hand, shaking his head as he walked. "People think putting on a uniform means the rest of us have to step aside." She turned her head, facing them for the first time. Her expression was calm, as if she were staring down a routine inspection. "If you need verification, I can present my military ID," she said. "If not, maybe you two could use a refresher course on how to assess people." Boone stopped. A brief moment passed, the sneer fading from his lips. Halton remained where he was, eyes fixed on his boots, as if weighing whether to step in or back off. Neither said another word. They simply looked at her, as if the notion that she could be a general, and a black general at that, had violated some unspoken code they'd never had to name. No one laid a hand on anyone, but the space between them suddenly felt heavy, as if an old prejudice had stirred awake from years of silence. In that place, what unsettled them wasn't the uniform. It was the way she wore it with too much dignity. Boone set his coffee on the patrol car's hood, still pointing a finger at the woman as if she were a bizarre roadside attraction. He jerked his chin, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Where'd you get that get-up? Costume fair? Or are you filming for some reality show?" The air in the parking lot tightened, not from any direct threat, but from the biting tone buried beneath what sounded like harmless banter. The woman adjusted her collar, her eyes level, neither lowered nor lifted above the man standing in front of her. "If you're truly concerned, I can show you my military ID," she said, her voice flat. "But if what you're judging is my skin color, then no document will ever satisfy you." Alton tilted his head, the grin slipping from his face as caution replaced it. Her words were calm, but each syllable landed heavier than a shouted defense. Boone didn't step back. He crossed his arms, slid his right foot behind him, and narrowed his eyes, as if trying to analyze something that didn't belong. "You're good with words," he said, leaning slightly forward, "but around here, everyone shows ID when asked, and I see a few things about you that don't quite add up." She said nothing. Her right hand moved smoothly to her chest pocket, drawing out a slim military wallet. The silver badge glinted behind the plastic, beside a clear photo, issue date, ID code, and raised seal. Halton glanced over Boone's shoulder and gave a small nod, acknowledging that everything was in order. Boone's expression didn't change. He no longer challenged the paperwork. He shifted suspicion toward her demeanor. "Then why are you here, alone?" he asked, voice lower now. "No escort? No official vehicle? Still in uniform? Out in the open like this?" "I'm still on duty," she replied with a colder edge, "and someone in this uniform is authorized to move freely while performing official tasks." Boone stepped closer, now within 2 full strides of her. "I don't see any travel orders. Do you have them on you?" She pulled a folded paper from her briefcase and held it up. A red stamp and a signature were visible in the bottom corner. He skimmed it, didn't respond, lowered his hand, but tension still traced his face. "The documents look fine," he admitted, "but I still think the vehicle needs checking. We've had a few impersonators lately." Halton hesitated, glancing toward his partner. The woman turned toward the car, placed the folder on the hood, opened the driver's door, and stepped aside, not in resistance, but without submission. Boone moved past her, flashlight in hand. He scanned the floorboards, the glove box, the dashboard, then the passenger seat. Nothing stood out. An unfinished water bottle, a mission-marked map, and a base access tag hanging from the mirror. She remained still outside, eyes fixed on the dry field in the distance, as if the search behind her were only the echo of something she had endured too many times. Boone stepped away from the vehicle, his certainty fading. Halton walked over, lowered his voice, and said, "That's probably enough," but Boone didn't answer. He kept staring at Dana, then finally turned to his partner and muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "We search when something feels off. And I still feel off." She turned back, her gaze sharpened. "Feeling off isn't a reason if you've never learned how to look properly, and maybe today's the day to start." Wind swept across the asphalt, stirring up thin layers of dust that curled around the feet of a passerby who had stopped for gas 2 stations back. An older man pulled out his phone when he saw a black woman in a military uniform being forced to face her vehicle, caught between the sharp voices of police officers. He raised his phone to eye level, sunlight washing over the screen and blurring the image. But before he could hit record, a voice from behind cut in, firm and menacing. "Put that phone away if you don't want trouble." Halton approached, his hand already resting on his belt. His gaze was cold, like facing something all too familiar, needing no explanation to make it clear that filming would not be tolerated here. The man hesitated, glancing at Boone as if seeking another cue, but Boone said nothing. He only gave a fleeting glance before turning his focus back to the woman standing still at the front of the car, her eyes calm, never shifting. Dana stood upright, arms relaxed at her sides. She did not flinch when Boone ordered, "Face the car." The command came without justification, offered no explanation, just a ritual carried out as if it were standard. She turned, calmly placing her palms on the hood, still warm from the sun. No one forced her, but it was clear she understood that refusing would turn the situation into something far worse than a routine check. Boone moved behind her, his eyes no longer scanning for confirmation, but rather searching for faults. His hand brushed past her belt line, his gaze tracing her uniform from shoulder to hem, as if looking for any inconsistency to use as his next excuse. Every move carried a disguised contempt beneath a composed surface. Halton kept his distance, occasionally glancing at the bystander who had tucked his phone away. The man retreated slowly toward the store entrance, saying nothing more. Others in the parking lot watched in silence, not one voice rising, not one person stepping in. That image, a soldier being forced to face her car, stood plainly before them, yet was swallowed by a silence where no one affirmed what was right or wrong. Boone began searching Dana's chest pockets, his movements swift and rigid. She said nothing in protest, but her body tightened like a wire drawn taut. Each breath kept carefully steady. He pulled out the leather wallet she had already shown, flipped through its compartments, then returned it wordlessly. Taking a step back, he looked toward Halton with a trace of frustration. "Nothing," he muttered. "You sure?" Halton replied, his voice low enough for just the two of them. Boone didn't answer. He moved around to the passenger side, opened the door, and bent down for another inspection. Everything was in order. Documents arranged neatly, maps marked with clear military routes, and an old notebook with the unit insignia embossed on the cover. Nothing was out of place, but the discomfort Boone felt didn't come from her errors. It came from the fact that everything was right, beyond fault. Dana remained standing, back straight, eyes fixed on a patch of light stretching far beyond the horizon. She couldn't predict what would happen next, but that didn't shake her grounding. Through the years crossing conflict zones, she had learned one thing. Some confrontations require no weapons. Sometimes silence alone is enough to make the other side tremble. Boone turned back and shut the car door with a loud click. He squinted at the woman standing in front of him, his look a silent dare to push again, even though everything that could be searched had already been searched and nothing found. His frustration came out as rudeness. He shook his head slightly, then muttered flatly, "Check the trunk." Dana gave a slight nod and moved to the rear of the vehicle, unlocking the trunk with steady, deliberate hands. Every motion was precise, without hesitation. She was used to being searched, but what made this moment different was the heavy silence from the onlookers. They saw everything, yet didn't move, and in that pause, she understood something. Calmness is not always endurance. It can be a choice not to yield space to fear. Boone glanced over the contents of the trunk. Military gear, a folded operations map, a few sealed supply boxes, and a neatly stored American flag in the side compartment. Finding nothing suspicious, he didn't change expression, just looked back at Halton and gave a nod. Halton stepped closer, and now his look had shifted from dismissive to sharply investigative. "What's your name?" he asked, voice cold and even. Dana turned to face him, eyes steady. "My name is Dana Harper. Rank E7. I can show my military ID if you need verification." Her voice was clear, direct, without avoidance or tension, as if delivering a briefing in a tactical meeting. Alton raised an eyebrow, trying to measure the truth in her tone. "What are you doing here? Why stop at this station? Do you live nearby?" The rapid-fire questions weren't meant to gain answers, but to wait for a slip they could use to justify an arrest. Dana answered calmly, explaining she was returning from an internal training session, stopping for fuel before heading to a staging point in a nearby district. She added that all travel papers and her military license were available for review if requested. Her words weren't received as cooperation. Boone shook his head slightly, like he'd just heard a joke. "Strange. A soldier wandering through a civilian area midweek with no report in?" he said, not expecting a reply, then moved to open the car door again, as if betrayal might be hiding behind a dashboard. Dana didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the one questioning her. "As I said, I'm ready to show my ID. You're welcome to contact my unit for confirmation," she said again, this time firmer, though still within the bounds of someone trained to work inside a system. Halton didn't respond. He turned to Boone and whispered something. The two men looked back at her with a different expression. Not simple suspicion, but the discomfort of losing control. They were used to people dodging, fumbling, or resisting, but this woman wasn't afraid, and she wasn't fighting back, which unsettled them. Boone pulled out his radio, held it midair, but didn't speak. Then, as if remembering a missing step, he asked, "Your ID? Let's see it." The question came late, as if trying to cover the lack of justification from the start. Dana opened her wallet, pulled out a polished metal card with a clear ID code and embossed unit insignia. She held it at chest height, not handing it over, just letting them look. Halton leaned in, scanned it, and stepped back without a word. But instead of ending the search, he turned to Boone and said, "Still not fully convinced. I'll check the rest of the documents." Dana saw it now. Their stares weren't about oversight anymore. What flickered behind their eyes was a mix of pride and discomfort. When someone's already decided they're right, any proof to the contrary just irritates them more. She put the ID away, stood her ground, and waited for what came next. Not because she had no options, but because the first steps of a real confrontation never begin with shouting. They begin when someone refuses to back down. The cold handcuffs tightened around Dana's wrists, but they failed to pull her gaze from the horizon. She tilted her head, took a slow breath, then gently pressed the side of her military-issued watch. A small screen lit up beneath the scratch-resistant glass, a blinking signal pulsing like it had been pre-programmed for emergency use. Dana tilted her wrist, maintaining her posture, eyes forward as if nothing around her posed a threat worth acknowledging. Boone stood nearby, his hand still resting on his belt, eyes caught somewhere between irritation and suspicion. Halton leaned back against the hood, sneering as he watched Dana work the device. Both men still seemed to believe she was just playing a part, some kind of half-hearted protest from a woman too used to using words to cover weakness. "I'm calling the Department of Defense," Dana said calmly, her voice low and even. She didn't look at them when she said it, but the words carried clearly through the tense air. At first, silence followed, as though the entire gas station held its breath. Then Halton let out a dry laugh, tilting his head toward his partner. "You hear that, Boone? She's calling the Pentagon. Sounds like something out of an action movie, huh?" Boone burst into laughter too, his voice echoing across the gravel lot. "Might as well call the president, or Marvel. Maybe she can get some superheroes to show up." They both laughed harder, the kind of laughter laced with derision and a sharp edge, like someone turning another's belief into a cheap punchline. Dana still said nothing, patiently waiting as the signal stabilized. On her wrist, an encrypted icon came into full view. A military-grade internal comlink had been activated, though she didn't say that out loud. She didn't need to. People who truly held power never needed to announce it with empty threats. Halton stepped closer, peering at the device, trying to find something to ridicule further. "That's a toy? Or do you have a satellite launch button in there too?" Boone laughed again, his voice loud enough to drown out the wind. But had they looked closely, they would have seen Dana wasn't aiming to intimidate. She was fulfilling a duty. She wasn't posturing. She was reporting. And for someone who had led soldiers through special operations, a call like this wasn't about seeking help. It was about triggering the highest level of incident oversight. Boone didn't know that. Halton didn't either. All they saw was a black woman with a calm, unsettling gaze, doing something they thought was pointless. But not everyone lives outside a power structure. Some know that silence can carry the weight of a full indictment. Dana didn't need to shout. She was documenting everything and transmitting it through a line neither of them had ever accessed, never been cleared for, and could not intercept once it was locked. The air shifted into a strange mix of mockery and apprehension. Halton stayed close, while Boone began glancing around, as if bracing for someone unexpected to arrive. In their minds, the call remained a joke. But inside the network, Dana had just awakened, and it was no longer about gas station cops. It had been encoded into an incident-level report, one that was already reaching places they never imagined would care. The signal had been sent for less than a minute when the response came. There was no request to repeat verification, no sharp intake of breath. The voice on the other end said just one sentence, even-toned and without emotion: "We're on our way." Then the call ended. No questions asked. No need to understand the specifics of what was happening. All that mattered was knowing that the caller had triggered a special protocol, and the person in restraints had the authority to use it. Dana tilted her wrist slightly, turned off the screen, her eyes passing over with the faintest trace of a sigh. She knew the response would come quickly, but she didn't move, didn't explain. At this moment, words were unnecessary. What needed to be transmitted had reached the right place. The rest was just waiting. Boone began to show signs of impatience, not from fear, but from not understanding what was going on. Halton scanned the area, his eyes darting the way someone does when they've been secretly recorded before, but he saw no one suspicious. He stepped closer to Dana, lowering his voice as if trying to probe. "Still think someone's coming to pick you up?" "The sheriff here's a buddy of mine," Boone chimed in, sneering. "Or what, someone from the Pentagon's gonna show up in a minute?" Dana said nothing. She didn't confirm or deny. That silence made them both uneasy, not because they were afraid, but because it felt like punching air. No reaction, no fear, no anger, no pleading, just stillness, and that was unfamiliar. 5 minutes later, a black SUV rolled silently into the gas station. No sirens, no flashing lights, no government plates, but it was the silence that made the air shift. Halton glanced at Boone, as if to confirm he wasn't seeing things. Boone furrowed his brow, instinctively straightening up, one hand brushing his holster. The vehicle came to a stop just a few steps away, engine cutting out right after the faint hiss of the brakes. No one got out right away. The doors remained closed, as if the people inside were giving them a pause long enough to feel the imbalance. Everything stood still, except for the steady hum of a nearby fuel pump. Boone moved forward half a step, about to speak, when the car door opened. A man in plain clothes stepped out, light brown shirt, pressed khakis, no visible insignia. But as he walked toward Dana, both officers' expressions changed, not because they recognized him, but because of the way he looked at her. The man didn't greet them, didn't acknowledge their presence to clarify roles. He went directly to Dana, crouched to check her wrists, then pulled a small device from his pocket, an old military scanner. The green light lit up instantly when he pressed it to Dana's watch. Only then did he turn to the two officers. He said nothing, didn't shift his expression, just observed. Halton stepped back, sensing something breaking in the air. Something he couldn't name, but knew meant he was no longer in control. Boone pressed his lips together, muscles tight, but his eyes had lost their steadiness. In just a few seconds, the presence of that unmarked vehicle and the man without insignia shattered whatever illusion of authority they thought they held. And the worst part wasn't that someone had shown up, it was that they had no idea what was going to happen next. Boone froze when the older man stepped out of the dark-colored SUV. There was no name tag, no insignia on his plain shirt, yet every step he took seemed to pull the air tighter. His presence was calm without spectacle. The subtle veins along his hand, the upright posture, and the sharp scan of his eyes bore the mark of someone who had stood at the front line of decisions no one else dared to command. Boone didn't recognize who he was, but instinct told him this was not a man to confront. The man didn't pause as he approached, didn't shake hands, didn't offer a greeting. He stopped in front of Dana, eyes settling on the metal cuff clasped around her wrist. His gaze sharpened for a single breath, then shifted to Boone and Halton. His voice rang out steady and clear, each word weighted without needing volume. Unlock the cuffs. Now. Boone raised his brows, but before he could reply, Halton had already stepped back, fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his belt. There was no motion toward a weapon, but the man's eyes alone were enough to make anyone reconsider their next move. He didn't ask for an explanation. He gave an order, and it didn't sound like it came from an average citizen, nor from someone looking to negotiate. Dana turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his for a moment. No thanks were exchanged. None were needed. They knew each other, knew his presence wasn't by chance. He hadn't come because of rank. He came because of a signal. A signal is sent only when conventional channels are no longer honored. Boone faltered, his gaze uncertain. "We're still investigating a suspected case of military impersonation," he said, but the words faded mid-sentence, as if even he no longer believed in them. The older man remained still. He didn't react, didn't raise his voice, didn't issue a threat. He simply stood and waited. The silence lasted no more than 10 seconds, but each breath Boone took felt heavier. Halton, unwilling to wait longer, stepped forward and quietly unlocked the cuff on Dana's wrist. The snap of the metal echoed dry and sharp in the strained air. Dana pulled her hand back, rubbed her wrist with her thumb, then gave the man a subtle nod. He turned his gaze back to the officers once more. This time his eyes were colder, deeper, as if committing every line of their faces to memory. There was no notebook, no camera, but the way he looked at them made both men feel like they had just been etched into a living report. He turned away, said nothing more, and led Dana toward the vehicle. Halton lowered his head, and Boone stood motionless. What unnerved him most wasn't being forced to follow orders. It was the inability to identify the man who gave them. What had just unfolded wasn't part of any training manual, nor did it fall within the typical jurisdiction of a town cop. The entire situation had shifted with an undocumented command and a presence that needed no business card. The dark SUV rolled away from the gas station, without lights, without sirens, leaving behind two officers standing frozen beneath the flickering sign that read, "Open 24/7. No words were spoken, but the sense that something far larger had begun to stir crept into every crack of a town that once believed it had power under control. And this time, it wasn't triggered by a headline or a viral video, but by a man stepping out of a car like he had just answered a summons from a system no one dared to name. Boone tried to take a deep breath, but a choking tightness slid down his throat. He looked at the man who had just ordered Dana Harper released, his eyes awkward, tinged with unease. Halton stood beside him, hand tightening briefly into a fist, then loosening, torn between a defensive reaction and an instinct to apologize. Neither of them had been trained for this kind of situation. Every script they had rehearsed, from stopping a vehicle, checking IDs, to asserting pressure, was based on the belief that they would always control the narrative. But now, the man's calm stare had stripped them of the control they thought was theirs by default. "We didn't mean any harm," Boone said first, his voice raspy and unsure. "It's just that she was in uniform without clear insignia. We just wanted to confirm things. Standard procedure." The older man's face didn't change. He turned toward Boone, eyes locking in, then shifted to Halton as if reading through a living report. He didn't rush, and he wasn't overtly cold. It was the composed tone that unsettled them more than any anger could have. Like a verdict already reached, with every word they spoke now only deepening its consequences. "You believe this was standard?" the man asked slowly, deliberately. "You handcuffed a senior officer when she hadn't said a single threatening word, hadn't made a single aggressive move, and had offered to present her ID?" Boone pressed his lips together. Halton swallowed. "This was not a uniform check," the man continued evenly. This was not something that could be explained away by protocol, because it did not start with the protocol. It started with how you looked at a woman of color in uniform and decided it didn't add up. Boone made a move to speak, but the man raised his hand, not to block him, just a clear enough signal that it would be smarter not to go further. "She's not just military," he said, voice low and precise. "She is a living emblem of what you were trained to uphold. And you cuffed her in public view, without cause, without a threat. And now you think an explanation will undo that?" Halton avoided his gaze. Boone tried not to let his hands tremble, but the man's words cut through him with quiet force. "What you did wasn't just wrong," the man concluded, his eyes colder now. "It's a stain that won't wash out. Not from you, not from the department." In that moment, neither of them responded. They didn't need to know exactly who he was. What they knew, deep down, was that if even part of what he just said reached the right channels, no justification would keep their records untouched. They weren't career criminals or abusers, but they had done what society was no longer tolerating: use reasonable suspicion as a weapon against people who don't look like them. And this time, the person they chose wasn't powerless. She was someone who could turn silence into testimony, and the vehicle still idled nearby. But everything was already clear. This wasn't going away. Dana Harper gently rotated her wrist, where the marks from the handcuffs still showed clearly. The older man silently bent down to remove them, his hands steady, yet his touch strangely gentle, as if he weren't unlocking a restraint, but rather laying hands on a symbol that had been disrespected. Dana said nothing as she stood. She didn't complain, didn't make a show of adjusting herself. She simply tightened her belt and straightened the edge of her uniform jacket to align it perfectly with her shoulder seam. Her movements were precise, quiet, just like the drills she had once led. And within that silence, each gesture became the strongest indictment of everything that had just happened. She didn't glance at the two officers, didn't raise her voice in condemnation, though by now a few bystanders had begun to slow down, and the idling car in the distance still hadn't left. The air hung suspended, as if the entire space were holding its breath, waiting for something to be said. Boone waited for a rebuttal. Halton anticipated a scolding, but what they received instead was a question so simple it chilled the spine. "Your names?" Dana asked, her voice low but clear enough for each of them to hear it without doubt. Boone hesitated. Halton looked over, then quickly turned away. The question carried no direct accusation, but in that moment it landed like someone flipping over cards at a table to see which one still held face value. There was no immediate answer. They weren't sure if revealing their real names now would be the right move, or if silence and a lawyer would serve them better. Dana didn't wait long. She turned, picked up the service cap that had fallen when she was restrained. Her gloves were slipped back on carefully, each finger easing through the dark leather as if no one had ever touched them with ill intent. The cap rested neatly atop her head, and she turned back once more to face them. "In the military," she said, "when someone does something wrong, they give their name and rank, not to be humiliated, but to be held accountable." Boone swallowed hard. Halton stayed still, but his feet shifted slightly, as if trying to find a safer stance. No one replied, but not replying was its confession, as if the silence itself was an admission that there was no defense for what had been done. The older man stepped up beside Dana. He didn't say a word, just laid a hand on her shoulder, a light but steady touch, as if confirming that she was still standing, still holding on to something no power or suspicion could take away. She nodded to him, then looked directly at the two officers one last time. "We'll be seeing each other again," she said. It wasn't a threat, just a matter-of-fact prediction, the kind of thing a soldier says when they know an investigation is not a possibility, but a certainty. The dark vehicle's engine came alive. Dana walked away slowly. She had nothing left to prove, because what she carried with her, her uniform, her eyes, was already enough for that gas station to realize that there are battles which need no guns, no blood, yet still push an entire system back a few steps. The car door closed. An ordinary moment, it seemed, but left behind on the concrete were two sets of eyes, one confused, one afraid. A light breeze passed through, just enough to stir the small insignia on her shoulder, a quiet reminder that silence does not always mean surrender. Sometimes it marks the beginning of a response, calculated to the second. The crowd wasn't large, but enough to form a quiet half-circle around the gas station. People who had stopped only to buy cigarettes or fill their tanks now stood still, their eyes shifting from curiosity to unease. A middle-aged man squinted at the insignia on the woman's left sleeve. He didn't speak right away, only stepped back, as if to make sure he had seen correctly something he had only ever witnessed on TV during National Honor Ceremony. "Sees a general?" The question slipped out like a whisper, aimed at no one in particular, yet it turned heads toward the woman, tightening her leather gloves and adjusting her cap. The red marks on her wrists were still visible, but her face held a calmness none of the officers had ever seen on a civilian being detained. The air thickened for a few seconds. There was something in the way the older man placed a hand on her shoulder, and the way she turned without a single display of anger, that made everyone begin to realize this was not a routine dispute about traffic law. Small details, the gold insignia on her shoulder, the way she moved, the grounded tone of her voice, fit together into a single, unmistakable image. This was not an ordinary woman. A young woman standing in the back, phone still in hand while waiting to pump gas, opened her camera as the scene shifted, not out of cheap curiosity but as a reflex of the age, documenting what felt impossible but was happening. She hadn't caught the moment the cuffs were put on, but when the woman adjusted her uniform, stood tall, and walked away, the force of that gaze struck directly through the lens. No editing, no filters, just a few raw seconds that made her hand tremble. She didn't know exactly what she was witnessing, but instinct told her this needed to be kept, because not every day does a soldier get insulted in uniform, and even rarer is the kind of silence that makes a whole block stop and think. The phone kept rolling. A breeze caught the hem of the woman's uniform, and in a passing frame, the light hit her chest insignia just right. The camera picked up every detail, from the precise embroidery to the ribbon near her wrist. Each line told a story of battlefield, discipline, and honor, and now all of it sat in stark contrast beside the hurried grip and mocking tone from men who believed authority came from a blue shirt and a patrol car. The girl didn't speak. She didn't need to. The clip had no shouting, no struggle, only the stark contrast between a removed pair of handcuffs and the woman calmly fixing her cap, nodding to her escort, then stepping into the car. It was just enough to make anyone who doubted her look again, just enough to raise a hard question. What gave law enforcement the confidence to treat a soldier like that? That woman never said who she was. She only asked for the names of the two who had laid hands on her. And now it was the bystanders who began asking each other, who was she? Where had she served? And why, in a place that seemed so peaceful, did it take someone from the Department of Defense to unlock the cuffs on a female general? As the car pulled away, the phone camera stayed locked on it until the taillights disappeared. The girl stopped recording, saved the video, and sat in the driver's seat. Her eyes hadn't left the screen. Something in her had shifted. It wasn't just anger or shock. It was the understanding that some confrontations leave no blood, but shake the conscience of an entire community. The video was less than 1 minute long, but within just a few hours it had surpassed hundreds of thousands of views. It began as an anonymous post with a simple caption, "A female officer treated like a fraud." Then the clip spread like wildfire. Veterans shared it in outrage, civilians passed it on in disbelief, and public figures began leaving comments as if they had just witnessed something far beyond a routine administrative stop. The video didn't capture the entire incident from the beginning, but what appeared on screen carried more weight than any official explanation. A woman in uniform was cuffed in broad daylight, standing at a gas station, not resisting, not speaking, while two officers laughed, hands fixed in exaggerated defensive stances, their mouths spewing words laced with suspicion. The image of her being uncuffed, silently adjusting her cap, and walking away without haste was the moment that turned the clip into a slap in the face to the notion of a standard check. The top comment under the video came from a veteran who had served in Iraq. He wrote, "I saw that the general led troops on the front lines. Seeing her treated like a criminal now, I honestly can't believe it." Thousands of likes followed, along with a flood of questions. Why use handcuffs without a clear reason? If she's a real general, what's happening to our law enforcement system? And the biggest question of all, if there had been no video, would this have been buried like so many other cases? What sparked outrage wasn't just the act of putting on the cuffs. It was the contempt in their eyes, the sneering laughs, the swagger in their tone that lit the fire. The utter lack of respect in every gesture couldn't be justified by any procedural handbook. The way they looked at that woman, not as a citizen, and certainly not as a high-ranking officer, but as a spectacle to expose and humiliate, crossed every acceptable boundary. Veterans began posting old photos, training footage, and documentation proving that Dana Harper, whose name was confirmed a few hours later, was one of the few African-American female generals who had once served as a national security advisor during a period of political crisis. No one knew why she had been alone at an out-of-town gas station. But by then, that question had been eclipsed by a more urgent one. Who allowed someone to mock a living symbol in broad daylight? On television, experts debated fiercely. Some defended the officers by citing verification protocol. But the more they spoke, the more intense the backlash grew. Snippets from the video were replayed repeatedly, not to provoke emotion, but to highlight the stark difference between a real suspect and someone treated like one purely because of bias. African-American women began sharing similar stories, being questioned at airports, followed in stores, doubted simply for carrying themselves with too much confidence. Dana's story was no longer isolated. It had become a symbol for a long line of moments when people had to choose between reacting or staying silent, between holding their dignity or demanding justice. And amid all the comments, one stood out quietly. They laughed when they cuffed her, but who's laughing now? The clip continued circulating, not for shock value, but because people didn't want to forget that moment when one woman's calm forced an entire system to reckon with itself. Information about the woman in uniform who was handcuffed at the gas station was no longer speculation after a social media user matched every insignia detail on her sleeve and the color of her uniform. They identified her in less than 2 hours. Dana Harper, a United States Army Major General, recipient of the Medal of Honor for commanding a multinational hostage rescue mission 3 years ago. She was one of the few black female officers to reach such a rank, and her image had appeared in multiple military training materials on leadership and resilience. That confirmation struck like a torch to an already smoldering wave of outrage. People were no longer just angry at the disrespect. They began asking a sharper, harder question. What if she wasn't a general? Because the core issue wasn't about her rank, but the assumption of suspicion based on race and gender. If she had been a teacher, a doctor, or just a civilian, would anyone have cared without video evidence? Would anyone have believed her, or would it all have disappeared into vague internal paperwork? The question spread beyond veterans into legal circles, activist networks, and everyday people who had felt mistreated by law enforcement. A civil rights attorney posted, "Dana Harper shouldn't have to prove she's a general to be treated with respect. But the fact that she is one shows just how broken our judgment system is." The post gained tens of thousands of shares and became a touchpoint for deeper analysis on how bias operates in public institutions. Local residents where the incident took place were interviewed. An elderly man told a reporter, "We've lived here our whole lives, used to getting asked for ID just for looking off. But this time is different, because the person they stopped wasn't a nobody." That statement, aired on the evening news, no longer sounded like an isolated opinion. It became evidence of a quiet habit, choosing suspicion first, asking questions later. An investigative journalist went further, pulling records on the 2 officers involved and uncovering previous internal warnings that had been dismissed. Reports of inappropriate remarks, of stopping the wrong people, had been submitted but never fully investigated. Now those records resurfaced, adding to the public's growing disillusionment. As the media storm built, hour by hour, people began calling it the Harper incident, though the real incident was never her conduct, but the system's reaction to someone they thought could be disregarded. If no phone camera had been recording, if no one had spoken up, this would have ended as a cold, procedural note. No misconduct found. By the end of that day, a photo of Dana Harper in full uniform standing in front of the Department of Defense appeared across major news outlets. No slogan, just her gaze steady into the camera, calm, without apology, as a reminder that sometimes one person standing firm amid distorted perceptions is enough to shift a society's reflexes. But the cost of being seen clearly should never be public humiliation. And the lingering question remains, if she hadn't been a general, would anyone have listened? That question alone kept millions from looking away. His name was Raymond Ortiz, an infantryman once stationed in Kandahar during that year's expansion campaign. He never thought he would make it out alive, let alone that the one who would drag him from the fire would be a female commander. When shrapnel landed less than 5 meters from his position, Ortiz took a hit to the thigh and couldn't move. Communications were down, the unit scattered, and hope was nearly gone, until a small team led by a black woman emerged from the east. She didn't shout orders. She simply knelt, pulled him up, shielded him from fire, and moved forward step by step, matching the faltering pace of a man on the brink of passing out. Now, 13 years later, Ortiz posted a photo taken from a helmet cam that day, a frame blurred by smoke and dust, but clearly showing the silhouette of a woman in a helmet with the name Patch Harper on her left shoulder. He didn't write much, but every word was soaked in gratitude. "She didn't need to know my name," still pulled me back from death. And today, watching them cuff her in the street, I realized far too many people only know how to respect what they understand and fear what they've never encountered. The post went viral at astonishing speed, not only within the veteran community but far beyond the military network. People began sharing old snippets tied to missions Dana Harper had commanded. Some recalled the time she led a multinational unit to rescue a group of civilian engineers held hostage in treacherous mountain terrain, a mission that even high-ranking generals had advised abandoning, but Dana didn't. Dana, Hadley, somebody took for her life wasn't ranked by title or race. One person left behind was reason enough to take the risk. Ortiz's story landed like a direct blow to the excuse, flooding online forums, that the officers were just following protocol. No protocol explains mockery of a uniform or ignoring an ID offered in good faith. But one truth became inescapable. A segment of society had grown comfortable assigning value to a person based on posture and vocal tone. Ortiz didn't speak on politics, didn't call for boycotts or protests. He simply told an old story. But that story tore through the veil of silence too many still use as their shield for complacency. Within veterans groups, the post became a discussion thread for hours. Another voice, a former combat medic, confirmed he had once joined Harper on a humanitarian escort mission. He recalled how, amid chaos and lack of equipment, it was Dana who insisted no civilians would be left behind. Her resolve never came with harshness, and her courage never needed a weapon. Those who had served beside her remembered that well. Local news outlets eventually picked up the story, but most coverage skimmed the surface. Online communities had already moved ahead. They dug deeper, cross-referenced, compiled, and from scattered accounts built a solid portrait of someone who had stood at the front lines for others, and now stood accused by a nation she once protected. Ortiz, in his next post, didn't talk about his feelings. He simply reposted the old photo, this time with one line: "We didn't kneel on the battlefield. We stood for people like her." And among the flood of thanks, anger, solidarity, and soul-searching, that line quietly echoed like a bell tolling for a conscience society had left dormant for far too long. The appearance of the soldier whose life she once saved sent public momentum surging. Raymond Ortiz's post didn't remain a personal tribute. It spread rapidly across veterans forums, military groups, and major human rights platforms. Thousands began retelling the story from different angles. Some focused on the system's silence, others pointed out the contempt in the officers' behavior caught on video, and many admitted they had once looked at someone as a suspect in uniform, rather than someone who had truly served. Support for Dana Harper grew without any formal campaign. It came from the genuine feelings of people who had been doubted, silenced, or seen someone else treated unfairly simply for not sounding like someone from the trusted class. Under every post, comments poured in, not just defending Dana, but expressing shame that it took discovering she was a general for them to feel outraged. One woman wrote that her husband had once been asked to step out of his car while wearing his pilot's uniform because he didn't look like Air Force. Another mentioned her father, a NASA engineer, who had his luggage searched 3 times at the airport just because his passport said he was born in Sudan. The public wasn't just discussing the handcuffing. They were peeling back layers of prejudice woven into daily behavior. How a white soldier walks through a checkpoint without pause, while a soldier of color gets asked where they were born, what unit they belong to, what business they have passing through a residential area. So when reporters reached out to Dana Harper for comment, she declined. The media received a polite refusal from a military spokesperson. "I don't believe this is just my story." Her response caught many off guard. They expected a bold statement, a denunciation, or at least a firm rebuttal of police conduct. But Harper said no more. She let events unfold with the same composure she showed when she stood up in the street, dusted off her uniform, and asked for the officers' names. The only thing released to the press was a handwritten note, clear and steady, without flourish. "I am just one among many who chose to stand on the front line. Thousands of others have been insulted without a camera, without rank, without a black SUV showing up in time. Ask yourself, if they weren't me, would anyone have spoken up?" That sentence, quiet, without drama or blame, spread farther than anything else. Students reposted it on school bulletin boards. A few teachers printed it out and taped it to classroom doors. Veteran groups read it aloud at meetings. Minority community centers began displaying it at their entrances, treating it as a mirror for how they'd been treated and how often they hadn't spoken up for others. Some asked whether Dana was preparing a lawsuit, but to those who knew her, that wasn't the point. She didn't need a courtroom win to prove she was right. What she wanted to reclaim wasn't an apology, it was the belief that people like her and those long silenced wouldn't have to wait for a call to the Pentagon just to be believed. By stepping away from the media spotlight, Dana didn't weaken the story. She made it stronger, because it was no longer about one person. It became the unanswered question echoing across society. If a female general can be treated that way in broad daylight, what's waiting for those without rank to protect them? And when will we finally start seeing people for who they are instead of their uniform, their skin, or whatever we've been taught makes someone credible? Beneath the high dome of the Capitol building, where long-winded speeches and flowery defenses were the norm, that day's hearing opened with an unusual silence. The Judiciary Committee had been forced to call an emergency session after the video of a female general being handcuffed without cause spread across social media, sparking fierce debate over law enforcement practices and the biases embedded in how people are perceived. The hearing room was packed with journalists, activists, and members of Congress seated behind nameplates, but most eyes were fixed in one direction: the woman in uniform, sitting silently at the witness table in the center of it all. Her name was Dana Harper. The general's insignia on her uniform didn't glitter under the camera lights, but it commanded the room every time she looked up. With no prepared script, Dana stepped to the podium with the kind of steady gait more suited to leading a platoon into battle than facing down a panel of lawmakers dissecting every detail. When the microphone clicked on, she didn't speak right away. Her eyes moved across the room, studying each person, as if assessing their posture, attention, and sincerity in this hearing. Then, in a voice that neither rose for emphasis nor dropped to stir emotion, she said, "The issue isn't with a few individuals. It's with how we're trained to see others before they even have a chance to speak." That alone made it clear that the weight of her words lay not in their length, but in their truth. The committee chair hesitated, perhaps about to prompt her for more, but then simply bowed his head and scribbled a brief note. Dana's brevity, instead of weakening the point, struck like a blow against the habit of stretching out problems until no one is left accountable. Outside the chamber, the press lined the halls. Inside, experts on policing policy took their turn after Dana. A former police chief from a major state raised the issue of unconscious bias in academy training, citing that most officers are never taught how to separate job reflexes from personal prejudice. A representative from the Legislative Military Council emphasized, if a female general still has to prove her identity just because of her skin color, what kind of suspicion are ordinary citizens facing? The conversation had moved beyond pinning blame on the two officers who cuffed her. Now pressure was mounting on the entire system of police ethics training, from the academy level to ongoing recertification programs. Internal reports were being reopened, especially those previously dismissed for lack of evidence of misconduct. Some began asking, why does it take a video, a rank, and military backing for such actions to be acknowledged as wrong? The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours. But the clip most widely shared online was just 40 seconds long. Dana, standing in the center of the chamber, stating plainly that what needed changing was not how we apologized after getting it wrong, but how we see people in the first place. The video had no dramatic music, no emotional narration. It spread because of the clarity in every word she spoke, like an indictment that needed no courtroom. An independent journalist wrote, "For the first time, a hearing didn't feel like a political show. Those who usually follow annual congressional sessions noted this one ended without applause, no group photos, only heavy stares exchanged after Dana Harper left the room. She didn't call for action or lead a movement, but left behind a sharper question than any protest. If a system trains its people to act from fear and bias, can we really expect it to deliver justice? And does that same system have the courage to admit it taught people to judge others based on skin color, gender, or uniform? Moments after speaking, Harper quietly returned to her seat, revealing no emotion. Though her words had just pierced through layers of institutional silence, she kept her composure. No one applauded, no one objected. The officials present understood what it meant. To deny her truth would expose their own neglect, and to support it meant admitting the need to break down walls built to protect order. When a senior senator asked if the officer's actions had been intentional or A result of flawed training, Harper answered without hesitation. They didn't need intent. The system already taught them. Her voice was even, steady, and devastating. That single sentence was clipped and shared across social media within an hour. Some called it a punch to the gut of police pride. Others called it an undeniable warning. It sparked debate not just among reporters and academics, but ordinary people who had long sensed something wrong in how authority treats those who look different. Many traced the problem back to outdated training, to drills that reward fast suspicion, and to lessons never meant to be questioned. Her answer didn't accuse individuals. It asked what kind of system keeps reproducing the same failures and calls them accidents. A criminology professor reposted the clip, writing, "This isn't an attack on officers. It's a challenge to how we train them." Law schools debated it in seminars. Students held panels titled Intent versus Instinct, when the system teaches both. As pressure mounted, some law enforcement agencies quietly reviewed internal policies, especially those with long records of biased routine stops. It was no longer just about one incident or two officers. The question now turned to the machine behind them. If a mistake becomes muscle memory, can we still call it a mistake? As evening newscasts replayed Harper's words, a retired veteran at a small bookstore in the city's east side wrote on his chalkboard, "Injustice doesn't need intent. It only needs enough people to look away." It didn't go viral, but it reflected the quiet shift in public conscience. Harper gave no more interviews. She returned to her base, declined TV invites, and resumed her duties. But her 9-word answer had opened a nationwide re-examination of how America builds its enforcers, how it defines suspicion, how it issues power, and why too many still confuse silence with safety. From that moment on, people stopped asking whether the two officers were wrong. They started asking who taught them to believe they were right. Following the explosive hearing and a wave of debate spreading across public forums, the press began digging into the backgrounds of the two officers who had handcuffed Dana Harper. Internal files once considered closed were suddenly reopened under mounting public pressure. In an exclusive investigative article, a local newspaper revealed that Officer Boone and Officer Halton were not strangers to controversy. Over the past 3 years, at least 4 formal complaints had been filed by citizens alleging verbal abuse or excessive force, most involving people of color or immigrants. A leaked internal memo showed prior warnings about Boone's inappropriate language when interacting with residents in diverse neighborhoods. Yet, in every disciplinary record, the cases ended with verbal reminders without any clear penalties. Many began asking, why hadn't these early signs of prejudice triggered concrete disciplinary action? The heat from media coverage made other officers at the department more cautious, but it also encouraged more honest voices to emerge. One young female officer, speaking anonymously, emailed the Internal Affairs Unit to share that she had once overheard a conversation in the break room between Boone and Halton, where they laughed about black folks playing soldier to get attention. She admitted she hadn't spoken up then, but what happened to Dana made her feel she could no longer stay silent. She insisted it wasn't an isolated incident, but rather everyday humor among a familiar group of officers. The former head of human resources at the department, retired for 2 years, also spoke out on a local radio show. He acknowledged that during his tenure he had proposed retraining programs on communication and unconscious bias, but those efforts were dismissed as unnecessary and too expensive. According to him, no one challenged the culture of racial joking because it was masked under camaraderie and a sense of team closeness. On professional law enforcement forums, the debate turned tense. Some defended the two officers, arguing that discriminatory behavior had not been legally proven. But on the other side, more officers from other jurisdictions began to speak up, saying the issue was not about proof, it was about an environment that had become too forgiving of deviance. A captain from a neighboring state shared, "When someone breaks protocol and there's no consequence, it stops being a personal flaw it becomes a system signal. A group of sociology students decided to collect public data on all complaints filed against the police force in the past 10 years within the county. They found that more than 80% of the closed cases involved people of color, and most had been dismissed for lack of evidence. These numbers, once buried in dry spreadsheets, were now turned into visual charts, spreading rapidly across social media. At the same time, residents began organizing community gatherings where they shared personal experiences of being profiled, searched, or insulted, stories they once believed were too small to matter. The police department where Boone and Halton served was forced to issue an official statement. At a press conference, the chief announced that the unit would begin a full review of all complaint intake and resolution procedures and would invite a third-party group to assist in re-investigating forgotten cases. Still, the deep lack of trust in the community meant the announcement brought little reassurance. People were no longer waiting for an apology, they were waiting for real action, starting with the end of tolerance, for the kind of laughter once dismissed as harmless. Dana Harper had made no further public statements since the hearing, but the stories surrounding her, and now surrounding the system that had allowed those officers to act unchecked for years, showed no sign of fading, because when jokes become ignored alarms, the only thing more terrifying is the silence that once surrounded them. A letter sent to the Human Resources Office of the local police department triggered internal shockwaves stronger than any news report. The author was a rookie who had joined the force only 8 months earlier. In the letter, he wrote that, although trained to serve the community, the real work environment made him feel like wearing the uniform each day was a battle with his conscience. He no longer wanted to stay silent in the face of biased jokes, knowing glances when rules were broken, or reports that quietly disappeared. So he requested a transfer to a different unit, fully aware it might label him as someone difficult to integrate. The letter, initially kept private, was eventually posted by someone inside the department on a law enforcement forum. Its opening line, "I can't keep pretending I don't see," became a widely shared quote, prompting many to reflect on how they had responded to moments that once seemed insignificant. Soon, other young officers spoke up on internal forums. One shared how a supervisor once tore up a report for causing trouble, even though it only documented offensive language during an arrest. Another recounted being isolated for 6 months after objecting to a random stop-and-search targeting a group of black teenagers. These stories alone may have seemed like surface scratches, but when put together, they painted a picture the leadership could no longer ignore. The head of Internal Affairs launched an anonymous survey across the department, asking officers directly if they had witnessed or experienced misconduct being covered up. Within 3 days, results showed that over 1/3 of respondents admitted to feeling pressure to stay silent or knowing of incidents that were deliberately buried. The findings were never made public, but they were enough to trigger a chain of emergency meetings. A group of senior officers was brought in for a closed-door session to review internal oversight procedures. One officer stood up and calmly said, "When young cops ask to be transferred because they can't stand the internal culture, the problem isn't a few bad apples. The problem is the basket that lets them rot." The department began drafting a reform plan. Initial proposals included creating an independent oversight board with community representation, updating training to address implicit bias, and examining how social conditioning shapes professional reactions. Once dismissed as academic, these concepts were now top priorities. Still, not everyone embraced change. Certain internal groups spread false claims that reform was a political campaign meant to smear the force. Some tried to distract from the debate by sharing feel-good videos of police helping civilians, as if to balance public perception, but this time the distraction didn't work. The issue was never whether good officers existed, it was what happens when the good ones say nothing. Dana Harper remained quiet, but, according to a close source, she agreed to attend a closed meeting with representatives from multiple police departments to share her perspective on internal reform. Her presence wasn't meant to promote boycotts or punishment, but to remind them that moral responsibility in law enforcement is not about skin color, It's about doing what is right, even when no one is watching. What is unfolding in the department now is not a loud revolution, but a quiet shift, sparked by one person who refused to stand beside silence. And that decision, though personal, is now forcing an entire system to ask itself, are we protecting the law or just protecting each other? The commendation ceremony took place in a modest hall within the Pentagon, attended by high-ranking officers and members of the press. A special plaque had been prepared to honor Dana Harper in official recognition of her calm resolve and dedication to protecting the dignity of the military. When invited to the podium, Dana walked with steady steps but in silence, her gaze forward, avoiding neither spotlight nor praise. She listened to the speech, nodded politely when her name was mentioned, then stepped to the microphone, not to say thank you, but to say something unexpected. She did not accept the award. To the surprise of everyone in the room, she requested that the honor be converted into a special scholarship fund. Dana emphasized, "I've never seen anyone change their perspective because of a plaque, but I've seen too many kids hurt because they were viewed through a narrow lens. Let this award be a belated apology from the system and a timely chance for those who were misjudged." Her words ended in a prolonged silence, not from shock, but because everyone knew she was telling the truth. A few months later, at a public high school in the small city where Dana had grown up, a new class was launched as an extension of the scholarship fund. The class bore no title with her name, no logo from any organization. On its plain wooden door was a single sheet of white paper with a handwritten line, "Have you ever misjudged someone?" That question greeted every student who walked in. It didn't demand an immediate answer, but it required everyone to carry it through the session. The class didn't focus on textbook knowledge, but on building critical thinking, questioning assumptions, and, most importantly, recognizing implicit bias within oneself. A young teacher was selected to lead the class, someone who had once been denied a full-time position because of her natural curls and skin tone that didn't meet traditional standards. On the first day, she shared how she had been told to look more professional, even though her students had always achieved the highest scores in the district. The kids chuckled awkwardly. A few lowered their heads, but then they began opening up about the nicknames they had been given, the times they were judged for their clothes or background. Dana didn't frequently appear in that classroom, but her name came up once a week, not as a founder, but as a symbol of choice. The choice to turn endurance into a path for those who hadn't yet found their voice. She had once said, "I don't need admiration. I just want people to stop looking down on those who aren't like them." On one rare visit, she sat quietly in the corner, while students debated whether a classmate should have been stopped at the school gate for wearing a hoodie. No one knew someone important was listening, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The story no longer revolved around her. It belonged to the next generation. That special class eventually spread to other schools. A few districts began changing how they interviewed teachers, adding questions about personal perception. Some local education boards mandated recurring training on unconscious bias. These changes weren't widely publicized, but their impact was far greater than any surface-level campaign. When a reporter asked Dana why she chose this path instead of demanding punishment, she simply smiled. "If I only wanted to lash out, I had enough power to do that from the very first second. But if I wanted something to last longer than anger, I had to start by planting a habit of how we see each other. And that habit, beginning in a small, nameless classroom, is now changing the way a generation approaches its dialogue with the world." That year's graduation ceremony took place in the main hall of the National Security Academy, where hundreds of cadets prepared to leave school and enter the force as protectors of the law. Under the warm yellow light shining down on rows of perfectly aligned seats, the microphone crackled to life as the principal introduced the final speaker. It wasn't a high-ranking official or seasoned officer, but a philosophy professor invited to speak about public ethics. The speech began with familiar reminders, then gradually shifted into a story that silenced the room. A year ago, a woman in uniform was stopped in broad daylight. She did not resist nor react violently, only asked the names of those treating her like a criminal. She had the right to be angry, the right to fight back. but she chose instead to leave a question that made the whole country pause. Has the system taught us to see each other by skin color or by dignity? The speech ended with the assertion that her conduct was not only military discipline, but a living lesson that justice lies not in the oath, but in daily choices. No one said her name. No photo was shown on the screen. But some names don't need to be read aloud to be present as symbols. At the back of the hall, in the section reserved for special guests, Dana Harper sat quietly among retired instructors and advisors. She wore no uniform, no medals, just a dark shirt and simple slacks. The way she sat, back straight, hands folded on her lap, eyes steady, made a few young cadets nearby feel as if they were being measured by a gaze that needed no words. After the speech, ceremonial music played, and cadets stepped forward one by one to receive their diplomas and bow to the faculty. As the ceremony ended, a few began to leave early, but one unexpected gesture stopped the entire hall. Dana stood. No one introduced her. No one asked her to. Yet nearly everyone turned instinctively, then stood as well. The sound of chairs moving echoed softly through the space. Some didn't know why. Others had never heard of her. But no one stayed seated. She didn't turn to acknowledge the room, nor did she hurry. Every step she took leaving that hall traced an invisible line dividing theory from practice. Former instructors bowed slightly as she passed, not for her rank, but for what she had chosen to uphold. A first-year cadet standing by the aisle whispered, "Who is she?" But no one answered, because the only one who truly could was walking away in silence. In the hallway, Dana met an older woman wiping away tears, proud of her child's graduation. The woman approached and said softly, "Thank you for not asking to be recognized." Dana nodded, gently touched the woman's shoulder, then walked on. She left no business card, made no plans to return, but from that day, a new lesson began circulating in law enforcement training circles, that a person's worth isn't in their resume, but in how others are forced to change when facing them. Those cadets, now officers in districts big and small, still remind each other of the woman with no name who once stood up and made an entire hall rise. Some printed that phrase on bulletin boards, others placed it on the final slide of their ethics lectures. Not as legend, but as a reminder. Every action, if done right, needs no title to be remembered, and that is enough for a silence to become permanent. The federal investigative team arrived in the town on a morning of light rain. They didn't show up with large badges or a convoy of cars that drew attention, but quietly entered through the back door of City Hall. In each person's hand was a thin folder containing copies of complaints and behavioral reports that had previously been categorized as internally resolved. No one spoke loudly, and the first meeting with the district attorney's office lasted less than 30 minutes. But in that short exchange, years of silence began to crack. One of the documents mentioned by the investigative team was a printed copy of an anonymous email sent to the Department of Justice system. The subject line was cold and simple. 6 cases, 6 cover-ups. In the body of the message, the sender listed each abuse of power in detail, including specific dates, personnel involved, and the outcome of internal handling. At the end of the email, the sender signed off using only a former title, administrative staff. Though no full name was given, investigators matched the identity within hours by cross-checking the resignation list from that year. The email copy was promptly encrypted, forwarded to the legal division, and archived under a separate case number. One member of the investigative team remarked, "This is a starting point, not a final piece." Previously locked files were reopened one by one, following the descriptions from the whistleblower. Some incidents had been recorded in the system as minor misunderstandings, but when compared with camera footage and witness statements, their severity proved far greater than originally reported. At the police department's records room, several junior staff were asked to surrender access credentials, with representatives overseeing each login. Many displayed confused expressions as familiar names were flagged with special markers in the internal system. A long-serving officer quietly shut down his computer and walked out without returning. Another, a rookie with only 2 years on the force, was called in to verify a radio exchange between patrol and command the night the fourth incident occurred. At the same time, the media remained focused on the viral video from the gas station, but the investigative team paid little attention to what had already been made public. They were watching for the unseen segments, overlapping data with altered timestamps, internal audio logs never properly backed up. A forensic technician specializing in data recovery noted that at least 4 manual edits had been made to files connected to the same patrol unit over the past 3 years. Though no formal conclusion had yet been issued, one official within the team affirmed that this was no longer a question of isolated misconduct. The appearance of the anonymous email pointed to a layer of silence within the department, but one that was no longer willing to remain silent forever. The former administrative staffer might have left, but the choice to speak up at the right moment had shifted the direction of the It was not an impulsive act, but rather confirmation of what the public had long suspected. Something was wrong, and it had been hidden for far too long. In the days that followed, life in the town went on, but the presence of the investigators cast a shadow over every administrative building. Everyone called in for questioning signed a confidentiality agreement, yet leaks began to surface little by little. A few local journalists started covering the story with neutral tones, avoiding conclusions, but clearly signaling concern. Several former officers now living out of state were summoned back to clarify their roles during the periods they once held command. In a closed-door meeting between investigators and prosecutors, one sentence was recorded in the internal memo. A system only needs a single crack in the right place for the entire mask to fall. This time, the crack did not come from outside. It came from someone who used to sit among the paperwork, silently signing off on reports, and now chose to speak, seeking truth after years of silence. The audio recording arrived from an officer who had joined the force less than a year earlier. Attached was a brief note: "I can't keep this to myself anymore." The recording, under 2 minutes, was taken during an informal end-of-shift gathering in the patrol room. The background was quiet, the voices clear. One man could be heard saying, "Uniforms don't mean a damn thing to me if the person wearing it has that kind of skin." There were a few short chuckles, then the conversation moved on, as if nothing wrong had been said. Voice analysis confirmed that the speaker was one of the 2 officers involved in the gas station incident. The comment was not just a personal offense, it pointed to deeper issues within the working environment. For many inside the department, the tape marked a turning point. What had once been dismissed as internal humor now carried weight under legal and ethical scrutiny. Confidence began to fracture from within. Though the audio remained classified, word of it spread. Copies of related documents began circulating internally, each marked confidential, but still reaching desks it was never intended for. Staff members came forward. A clerk admitted to overhearing the comment months earlier, but hadn't thought it mattered. A mid-level supervisor said he had once proposed bias training but was told it wasn't necessary. Tension mounted during meetings, conversations grew shorter, glances sharper, trust no longer flowed easily. One training officer confessed, "We were never taught to address these things. We were taught to ignore them so long as no one got hurt." Officers began re-examining their behavior, moments when they laughed along, said nothing, or let something slide. One young officer who had worked closely with the man on the tape submitted a resignation letter stating, "I refuse to advance by pretending I didn't see." In a note to the investigation team, he added, "Thank you for making it impossible to normalize what isn't right." As more documents came in, the team realized the problem went far beyond 2 individuals. It wasn't just about one video or one ugly remark. It was a system too long shaped by silence. And now, with truth surfacing from the inside, it would never return to how it was before. That day, the 17-year-old appeared before the cameras with a steadier face than when he had first been seen in the blurry mall footage 3 years ago. He recounted the incident in detail, without flinching or minimizing the humiliation he had endured. When asked why he chose this moment to speak out, he replied with a sentence that brought silence to the entire room. because back then, no one believed me. But now, people are starting to believe others. His story quickly spread across social media platforms. He did not beg for sympathy. He simply wanted what had happened to him not to happen again to someone else. Those who had witnessed the incident at the time began to come forward, some offering apologies for turning away, others writing letters confirming they had seen Boone's actions but didn't think they were serious enough to intervene. A public meeting was held that weekend, drawing local residents and national media. His mother, who had submitted complaints to 3 levels of government without receiving a reply, was invited to speak. She stepped to the podium with a small stack of papers in hand, but barely glanced at them throughout her remarks. Her voice was steady, not trembling, yet enough to pull the room into a shared stillness with every word. She didn't repeat the complaint. Instead, she spoke about the aftermath, nights when her son wouldn't leave his room, the school terms he had to change because of whispers and stares, and the one time he cried after seeing Boone featured in a segment honoring police achievements. "No one asked what I needed," she said. "They just messaged that the matter had been handled internally. But in our house, nothing was handled at all." When she finished, a flood of questions was directed at the session's administrators. Those who had worked in internal security were asked to explain how complaints had been processed. A representative from the prosecutor's office admitted the mother's complaint had been passed through 3 departments and dismissed for lack of investigable ground. The session's moderator sat upright, never interrupting, only nodding slightly when the mother ended with, "If you think this is an old story, I'm sorry, my son is still living in it every day." From the back, some parents voiced their support. One stood and shared how his child had once been detained at a mall for walking alone and looking around too much. A former security guard asked to speak, recalling how he once saw Boone check the bags of a group of black students without any clear reason. These stories weren't coordinated, but they all pointed to the same core, being profiled and feeling powerless to change it. That evening, the local news station aired the mother's speech during its primetime broadcast, quoting her final words verbatim, "I don't need an apology for the past. I need assurance that no one else has to write a letter like mine in the future." The comment section lit up with debate, but among the noise, one post stood out. "Turns out, courage sometimes just starts with telling a memory someone told you to forget." Her and her son's story didn't change the system overnight, but it forced internal reports to be reopened. A new committee was formed to review complaints previously dismissed for lack of evidence. A slow, quiet current began to move, one sparked not by a lawsuit or protest, but by a teenager refusing to let his memory be rewritten. And from there, those who once stayed silent began to listen, not because they were forced to, but because they simply couldn't look away any longer. That afternoon, Mr. Gerald Mays, a former police officer with more than 30 years of service, appeared before the local press with a heavy gaze. He had never spoken publicly about what he had witnessed during his career, but when asked why he chose this moment to speak out, he answered plainly, "Because I don't want to die still keeping quiet." In his statement, he recounted an incident from over 10 years ago, when a colleague of his pointed a gun at a teenager simply because the boy wore an oversized hoodie while waiting for the bus near a wealthy neighborhood. "We were told to write that the situation showed signs of suspicious activity," he said, his voice dropping at the last line. But in truth, it was just bias. His admission sent shockwaves through the media and spread quickly across social platforms. People began questioning past incidents that had been overlooked, tapes that were never released, internal reports that ended with "no misconduct found." This moment felt like the lid had been cracked open on a box everyone knew existed, but no one dared to touch. And as it opened, stories poured out like stones fitting together into a larger picture, no longer isolated events, but a system connected by silence and cover-up. Newsrooms started receiving handwritten letters, emails, and anonymous messages from those who had experienced or witnessed being targeted for their appearance, address, or even the way they spoke. A mother recalled her son being held at a precinct for 2 hours with no reason, just because he forgot his student ID on his way home. A former bus driver said he was stopped repeatedly due to his tattoos. These stories, once brushed off as no big deal, have now resurfaced as crucial memories that made it clear the handcuffing of the female general wasn't the start, it was the breaking point. On a late-night radio show, the host read excerpts from the letters sent to the station. No music, no added commentary, just a slow, steady voice letting each story carry its own weight. An 8-year-old boy wrote about watching his father get yelled at and shoved onto the sidewalk for not showing ID while walking the dog. An elderly woman shared a memory from 50 years ago, when her brother was taken away and never came back, and her family never received a formal explanation. These weren't front-page stories. They were small, personal moments long swept aside. But, linked together, they exposed how deep and widespread the problem had become, not about one person or one city, but about how an entire system had learned to hide behind routine denial. At a law school forum, students debated the legal value of delayed testimonies, and whether reopening old files was feasible. One young woman said, "We were taught that truth matters only when it arrives in time, but maybe its greatest value is that it can still move people, even when it comes late." The hall fell silent for a long moment, as if recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that justice doesn't just come from law, but from someone finally daring to speak after being silenced for too long. What began with a pair of handcuffs turned into something far larger. It was no longer about a general or a humiliated teen. It was a test for an entire community. Would we still dare to look away, now that the stories have returned, piece by piece, with more than enough truth to be undeniable? In Washington, the national hearing took place without cameras or formalities. The chair, an independent senator known for pushing reform, opened with a pointed reminder. We're not here to talk about exceptions, but about first instincts when facing another human. The room was tense. For once, lawmakers weren't debating budgets. They were confronting how a single glance could decide someone's fate. Up front, surrounded by experts and officials, sat the woman once cuffed in front of a small-town station. No uniform, no medals, just presence. And that was enough to silence many who had long defended the old system. She wasn't a debate point. She was the question itself. What makes someone see a woman in uniform as a threat? She spoke without notes, her voice calm and measured. We've trained technique, we've updated procedure, but we haven't addressed instinct. When an officer sees someone new, is the reflex control or suspicion based on skin, clothing, or location? Then she told a story. In combat zones, I taught soldiers, if you're going to fire, fire on facts, not fear, and if you're unsure, look again. One senator, once skeptical, didn't speak this time. He just nodded and took notes. Soon after, members proposed making unbiased observation a core class in all academies. The hearing ran nearly 6 hours. From botched airport checks to biased stops, each example added proof. The problem isn't just action. It's what allows bad action to feel routine. When it ended, no sides were declared winners. But many agreed she belonged there as more than a symbol, as a bridge between law and life. She had been doubted, questioned, cuffed, and now, with those same people, she chose to engage. As she left, no one asked for her title. They simply nodded, because she had made them examine their own instinct, and that, perhaps, is where change begins. When invited to speak one last time during the hearing, she rose slowly, the same calm posture, eyes steady but direct, enough to make those who once held authority subtly adjust how they sat. She carried no documents, needed no aid to prep her remarks, just placed both hands on the long wooden table and looked straight ahead. The room was silent, not out of tension, but because everyone sensed she wasn't there to conclude something, but to leave behind something, meant to be thought over longer. Some people once told me, she began, that being on alert is a survival instinct in this line of work. Her tone was steady, neither defensive nor confrontational. She paused briefly before continuing. But I wonder, if someone's mere presence makes you feel out of control, maybe the problem lies in how you understand power. There was no applause, no outcry. Her words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples reached back toward those seated around her. Security chiefs, tactical trainers, lawmakers who once helped draft clauses that legalized suspicion. She wasn't just questioning a system. She was asking each person within it to reflect. Are they holding power to protect others or to validate their own presence? A young legislator stood, then sat back down. Maybe what needed saying had already been said, and maybe the real lesson doesn't come from debate, but from complete listening. A female coordinator stepped forward and closed the session with a gentle remark. We'll send a full summary to the reform councils, and before we adjourn, I think each of us leaves today with more than a report. No one rushed to exit. People remained seated a few minutes longer, as if letting their thoughts settle before walking out of a room where the meaning of power had just shifted. Out in the hallway, small groups began speaking in softer tones. A federal security analyst lowered his voice and told a colleague, I used to think doing things by the book was enough, but today I realize that when right lacks awareness, it can still be used to do harm. The hearing ended without a headline, without new orders, without a press conference. But in professional circles, it was already being called a turning point when the language of reform came not from a politician, but from someone who once endured in silence and chose to stand at the right moment. Returning from the hearing, she posted nothing online, spoke to no reporters, and kept no notes from her speech. But on the evening news, one sentence was quoted in full. If someone's presence makes you feel out of control, maybe you never had real power to begin with. Within hours, it appeared in professional reflex training sessions, taped to police station walls, and quoted in student essays on the meaning of justice. And the hearing ended not with recognition or argument, but with silence, a silence so deep that no one tried to interrupt it. People accepted that to change a system, the first thing you might need to relearn is how to listen, not to reply, but to see what you've never seen, in a gaze, in a voice, in the way someone dismissed still stands tall in a field that once believed it was always right. The program, Understand Before You React, was introduced at a closed meeting of law enforcement academies. Under soft lights, the coordinator began with, We don't need more theory, we need shared memory. No applause followed, but the room shifted. After long debates on reform, change began where it mattered most, in the classroom. There were no tests or grades. Each session was a space for real voices, not instructors, but people harmed by misjudgment. They didn't accuse. They simply told their stories, quietly and clearly. One woman recalled being pulled aside at an airport because of her name and how her daughter's stare hurt more than the search. The trainer asked, if it were you, what would your first reaction be? Another day, a young man shared how wearing a hoodie led to a stop, a 40-minute delay, and a missed scholarship test. No charges, just lost an opportunity. Who retakes that exam for me? He asked. Slowly, cadets began bringing up unconscious bias on their own, forming discussion groups without being told. The tone of the academy shifted. Slogans on bulletin boards were replaced by quotes like, I feared police more than thieves, or silence isn't consent. They weren't decorations, they were reminders. The most important lessons weren't in drills, but in remembering what others had been forced to endure. By month 3, schools began asking to adopt the model. It spread not by mandate, but by choice. Understand Before You React wasn't just a course. It was a process, not to teach the right response, but to ask a harder question. Why was that your first response? For many who once sat in command, this shift feels unfamiliar. For years, security training emphasized procedures over introspection. But when real stories are told, without sarcasm or embellishment, they carry more weight than any academic lecture. It's the simplicity in how they're told, that makes them impossible to ignore. And from within that classroom, a new generation of officers is emerging. They aren't trained to always be right, nor to win. They are learning a skill harder than handling a weapon: how to understand a person before reacting to them. That kind of understanding is sometimes the only thing that keeps the line between authority and harm from being erased. One journal entry was found after a final exam, tucked in the wrinkled notebook of a young cadet named Marcus. He wasn't known for high marks or standout achievements, but at the year-end review, when asked what changed his view of the profession, he didn't cite a lecture or a video. He quietly placed his notebook on the table. The underlined sentence read, "She didn't resist, but by standing still, she made an entire generation stand up." No one required students to keep a journal, nor to record personal reflections. Yet after each storytelling session, words began to appear quietly. Some wrote about feeling uneasy hearing a mother describe her son being suspected just for dressing down. One admitted they once believed quick reflexes meant professionalism, but now questioned whether they had ever reacted to the wrong person at the wrong time against the very ethics they were meant to uphold. His class had no instructor, yet strangely, everyone began to remember it as a real course. During breaks, students called it by one name: the class of the handcuffed woman. No signage, no set agenda, no official schedule, just that every time someone left that room, they were quieter, but their eyes a little more open, as if they'd stepped out of a reality where mistakes weren't personal failures, but the result of silence left unchallenged. Her name was never said in the courtyard, nor did it appear in the curriculum, but her story was passed from one class to the next. They spoke of the moment she stood up from the cold ground, smoothed the sleeves of her uniform, and asked for the name of the person who had handcuffed her. Not to threaten, not to retaliate, but to ensure that person remembered. He had touched a dignity he never tried to understand. From that story, cadets began rethinking the true value of authority. Their debates no longer relied on regulations, but on lived experience. One student who once resisted bringing emotion into training volunteered to lead a story session with a survivor of police violence. Another group started a peer forum just to reread shared stories, not to analyze but to listen again, more respectfully. That class became a moral anchor no textbook could replace. It remained a constant reminder that speed doesn't always equal correctness. And sometimes what grows maturity isn't the right to command, but the ability to understand the limits of intervention. In the hallway of the academy, a torn paper note was taped to the wall. "She stood still. We began to move." Faculty never opposed the name the class of the handcuffed woman, though it was never formally recognized, because everyone understood influence doesn't require a line on an org chart. It just needs to be revived each time someone pauses before a bias, or changes their question when meeting someone unlike themselves. These changes are small, but like quiet links in a chain, they slowly reshape a structure once too rigid. And so, from one moment of being wronged, she ended up teaching more than any lesson in the academy's history. Not through lectures, but by presence. Not through argument, but by a posture that needed no defense. That class goes on, no nameplate, no teacher, but with each new generation, more begin to see more clearly and choose to stand still when it matters. The retirement letter was submitted internally with no farewell note or formal statement. At the bottom, beneath the signature, was a handwritten line, the ink slightly smudged as if written with hesitation. "I once stayed silent because I feared being seen as betraying my team." It wasn't an excuse, just a quiet admission, and it seemed to open the door for confessions long kept in the dark. The sender had been a respected training officer known for his calm and tact. For nearly 3 decades, he had been praised as a model of integrity. But when the video of the general in handcuffs went viral, he chose silence. He didn't support it, nor did he intervene. He watched and chose not to look deeper. Now, without being asked, he stepped away, a quiet gesture of accountability. At the same time, An administrative clerk from the ground floor of the station quietly packed a nearly 10-inch thick file into a brown cardboard box. Inside were complaints, notes, and call logs, set aside over 3 years for technical reasons. She said little, only called the federal investigation team and brought the box to a discreet van behind the bus stop. When asked why, she answered, "I used to think silence meant safety. Now I see it just lets wrong things keep going." It wasn't anger, just a fatigue that comes from walking past drawers full of truth, day after day, with no one ever asking to open them. Those documents were more than evidence. They were traces of attempts to speak up that never reached the right people. A father's letter asking why his son was searched at a bus stop, a late-night call from a crying woman whose daughter was humiliated in public, and reply forms marked "under review" or "no clear violation found." The clerk's decision changed the investigators' approach. Instead of waiting on top-down permission, they turned to those long-ignored archivists, dispatchers, night patrol drivers, and listened, not by form, but by memory. And from those memories, the shape of a system emerged, one that functioned not through orders, but through habits, where temporarily hold the file required no command because everyone already knew when something should be forgotten. Avoiding eye contact when seeing misconduct was mistaken for loyalty, where silence was seen as professionalism, when, in truth, it was the deepest crack in the foundation of ethics. When the files were officially reviewed, many notes revealed a quiet culture, records written for the sake of appearing responsive, phrased vaguely to avoid accountability, logged but not followed, accepted but never verified. And the scariest part, no one believed they were doing anything wrong. They were simply doing what they had learned. The retirement of the veteran officer and the quiet act of a female administrator didn't make headlines, but to the investigation team they marked a turning point, a responsible exit, and a quiet stand. Sometimes, to revive the truth, it takes someone not to speak out loud, but to quietly unlock a door long sealed. From that moment, the system couldn't go back, not by order, but because someone had laid the first stone for a new beginning. The city attorney's office released over 20 names cleared of charges for unauthorized filming of law enforcement. Most were people of color, previously fined, detained, or sent to correctional programs for using their phones at the wrong time. Each received a letter of apology, with the closing line, "On behalf of the system, we acknowledge our misunderstanding of your civil rights." Some shared the letter online. Others kept it tucked away, as a reminder that truth once lost to bias was finally named. One man, once arrested for filming an unjust stop, was now a law student. He said if that day hadn't happened, he might never have pursued justice. His apology letter now sat beside his textbook, more powerful than any scholarship. As media outlets kept asking why she wouldn't speak, the woman, once handcuffed, stayed silent. No interviews, no posts, no comments. That silence became a mirror. When she didn't define the story, the focus shifted back to the system. Why was filming treated as a crime? Why must someone be exceptional to be believed? In classrooms and council halls, people began to reflect. A professor said, "If we ask, 'Who is she?' before asking, 'What happened?' then the flaw is in us." A city official admitted, "We punished out of fear, not law." Her silence forced people to stop justifying and start listening. And that silence, more than any speech, became her lasting statement. The handwritten letter came from a small town, a place that had yet to find its voice in national conversations about justice. The little girl was only 10 years old, her words scrawled across a piece of lined school paper. "I don't know why people are afraid of my skin, but if I wore a uniform like yours, would they believe me?" The letter reached the woman inside a carefully sealed envelope, sent to the unit address someone in the girl's family had found after many inquiries. She read each word slowly, then folded the letter as if holding something sacred. She didn't respond with a public statement or a video. Instead, she sent back a single photo with no message. In the image, she stood tall, her back to the camera, facing dozens of people kneeling. It was taken from behind, her posture unshaken, her uniform crisp, her solitude amid the crowd forming a quiet gravity. No one knew the full context of the photo, only that it spread quickly and on the girl's palm appeared just one line. "Now I understand." That photo began appearing in civics classes, on community center bulletin boards, and even in ethics textbooks, captioned with, "Bravery isn't shouting, it's standing firm when everyone else bows." The little girl later shared in a school forum that the image inspired her to enroll in a basic emergency training course, not to become a soldier, but to stay calm when others panic. Their story, of a child who had never left her town and a woman who had once led an entire battalion, was connected by an invisible thread of resolve. Adults began questioning what they once saw as normal. A principal in the Midwest said, "If a child has to ask whether wearing a uniform makes her believable, then we've been teaching the wrong things." After that, several elementary schools began experimenting with ungraded sessions where children were invited to ask questions instead of answering them. The girl's question became the first example. Simple, yet enough to shame the grown-ups. As for the woman who received the letter, she kept her old routines, showing up on time, remaining quiet in meetings, and avoiding interviews. But she began spending more time on logistics training in overlooked regions. She didn't lecture or put an arm around anyone. She simply showed up, watched, listened, and occasionally adjusted the stance of a young trainee not yet steady. That presence, slowly, became something others adjusted themselves to without being told. Years later, when someone asked her about the photo she sent to the girl, she replied, "I didn't know what to write, but I thought if that child was brave enough to ask, she deserved an image that didn't need words." That answer was later quoted at an education conference as proof that words aren't always what they seem. Sometimes, how we choose not to speak becomes the strongest form of guidance. And so, from one photo turned away, one child's question, one unspoken choice, a new foundation quietly emerged for how we rebuild belief. A belief not born of authority, but of how one chooses to stand tall before uncertain eyes. Even without a name, that belief continues to grow with each new generation. A high school essay written during a routine civics class stood out. The teacher had simply asked students to reflect on something that changed how they saw the world. He began, "Silence is not neutral. It is a choice." He described watching the video of a woman in uniform being handcuffed and the silent bystanders. What unsettled him wasn't the abuse of power, it was how normal it looked when no one spoke up. The essay wasn't long or full of theory. He just shared how he shifted from thinking silence meant innocence to realizing silence keeps injustice going. One teacher quietly pinned it on the school bulletin board. Soon, copies showed up in other classrooms, then on school social media, and beyond into broader education circles. The essay sparked talks rarely had in his small town, where people usually discussed crops or test scores. Parents started asking their kids questions like, "What would you think if someone in uniform was doubted just because of their skin?" Dinner tables became places where silence and assumptions were openly examined. Parent meetings shifted too. Some pushed for lessons on social awareness and how to respond to unfairness. One father, a former soldier, said, "I used to tell my son to stay quiet if unsure. Now I tell him silence isn't always safe. It's something to rethink." At the library, a children's reading hour replaced fairy tales with a real story of a veteran denied service based on appearance. Students wrote reflections. One wrote, "If you see someone treated badly and say nothing, what did you just learn from that silence?" In this town, people started saying, "A uniform doesn't make someone trustworthy, how they act does." Sometimes one essay can start the change that a community has avoided for years. The trial of Boone took place in federal court, under an atmosphere tense but not chaotic atmosphere. Media outlets had gathered early and civil rights groups were present with banners demanding justice and transparency at every step of the proceedings. Boone appeared composed, but his eyes no longer held the confidence he had shown when walking through the precinct door in the video that once sparked outrage. The indictment, spanning over 30 pages, detailed 8 serious violations throughout his career, 2 of which were related to targeting citizens based on skin color. Prosecutors presented evidence one by one, from audio recordings of him openly insulting a black trainee to testimonies from those he had publicly humiliated or harassed. The witnesses no longer appeared afraid. They stood before the court, recounting in detail the encounters that stripped them of dignity simply for not resembling him. A woman who had been handcuffed by Boone in a supermarket parking lot for looking like a troublemaker appeared as a key witness, sharing for the first time the full story of how she had become a suspect for no clear reason. The defense attorney tried to redirect the narrative, citing occupational stress and professional reflex. But those very terms only fueled further backlash. The public no longer accepted prejudice as a shield for abusive conduct. Over 5 days of hearings, every question cut to the core. How deeply had the system enabled someone like Boone to act unchecked for so long? As for Halton, the internal investigation concluded there was insufficient evidence for criminal prosecution. However, the administrative review identified major shortcomings in oversight and response. While Halton had not issued direct orders, his leadership role and silence in the face of internal reports were considered contributing factors to an unregulated environment. He was demoted from supervisory chief to internal affairs officer and barred from handling any public-facing duties for the remainder of his term. The announcement stirred the police department, not because the penalty was too severe, but because it marked the first time in years that indirect accountability had been formally addressed. A young officer wrote in the Academy's internal bulletin, "We don't need to see them dragged away in cuffs. We just need to know that neglect has limits." The case became a topic of debate within the law enforcement community. Some argued the punishment was fair, since Halton had not been directly involved. Others believed that without his inaction, the violations might have been uncovered much earlier. Boone and Halton no longer held public-facing roles. A new oversight board was formed to reassess all cases internally processed during Halton's tenure. Meanwhile, an independent media-led survey revealed a sharp decline in public trust in local law enforcement over the past 3 months, but also a growing belief in the system's ability to correct itself if the truth continued to come to light. Boone sat still as the verdict was read. No cheers, no tears, just the quiet weight of something ending. But from that end came the start of something else, a shift toward responsibility and transparency, not written in formal statements or press releases, but reflected in the eyes of those who had once been dismissed and were now finally being heard. The closing arguments weren't filled with legal jargon. Instead, the prosecutor quoted a witness statement. "It's not that I'm too calm. It's that you've never been used to the calm of someone who doesn't need to prove herself." It came from the woman Boone had handcuffed, said softly, without aggression, but it landed like a question no one could avoid. Around the courtroom, people exchanged looks, unsettled not by what had been said, but by what it revealed. The silence that followed wasn't staged. It was earned. There were no live streams, no banners, no drama. Just an unspoken understanding that this wasn't just about one man's guilt or innocence. It was about how power had been used, and how long others had been expected to stay quiet. The jury left to deliberate. The rest waited, not just for a ruling, but for something deeper, a reckoning. Reporters began writing, then stopped. Maybe because this story wasn't made for headlines. It belonged in conversations, at kitchen tables, in classrooms, in the spaces where policy meets personal memory. And that day, the courtroom wasn't just a judgment stage. It became a space for witness, where those who once stood alone now stood together. As people left, their steps were slow, as if leaving a place where something important had just been unlearned. Outside, no cameras chased the defendant. No crowds demanded punishment. Instead, a few residents taped a whiteboard to the gate of the police station, once been sealed for investigation. It read, in uneven but firm writing, "We've heard you. Now it's your turn." In that moment, change didn't roar. It echoed, quiet, steady, impossible to unhear. The book was released quietly on a weekday morning, with no signing event and no listing in any publisher's promotional catalog. The author, a young journalist, had once been denied publication when trying to recount the entire incident without embellishment. He decided not to wait for permission. In ebook format, he uploaded the original manuscript to an open platform, with a single note attached. "If this deserves to be remembered, it will find its way to exist." In less than 3 days, the book had been downloaded thousands of times, shared through personal emails, academic circles, and even slipped into the internal networks of several security training institutions. The cover featured no title, only a monochrome image, a cuffed hand, a 6-pointed star-shaped scratch marking the wrist. The image was never explained in the book or any preface, but those familiar with the case understood it was a still frame from a video long taken down, where a woman, detained for non-compliance, simply raised her hand without protest. That scratch was the only physical trace left on her body, and because of that, it became a symbol that transcended legal context, a star that represented neither rank nor power, but stood as proof that endurance, even when deemed invalid, could awaken the conscience dulled by habit. The author did not use his real name. He wrote as an outsider, yet imbued each passage with an emotion that could only come from having witnessed it firsthand. There were no direct accusations, no deep legal analysis, only fragments of events, brief, visceral, and requiring no further explanation. One section recorded the feelings of a student in an ethics class. Another captured the memory of a mother once invited to speak before a local council, and another shared the account of a rookie officer requesting a transfer. Together, these formed echoes that compelled readers to connect the pieces themselves. Those downloading the book weren't close friends or fellow journalists. Most were students, teachers, veterans, or individuals who had never posted online but still forwarded the PDF to colleagues with a line like, "I think you should read this." The book was quietly printed in hard copy at small libraries, sealed in nameless brown envelopes, and placed in suggested reading sections. Some high schools used their excerpts as prompts for reading comprehension. Some security academies asked students to write personal reflections on selected chapters, with no grades, no feedback required. The author declined all interviews. He left a brief note on his page, "I didn't write to be known. I wrote so that no one else would have to spend more time proving they deserved to be believed." After that, his account went silent. But the book continued to circulate. It never made any bestseller list, nor earned high ratings on commercial platforms, yet it became required reading in a new training program run by a nonprofit focused on legal reform. Some said its quiet spread was more powerful than any sponsored campaign. No story stays authentic when forced into slogans, and no awakening lasts if it only comes from fleeting outrage. The book was slim, with few chapters, but it was translated into many languages. The French, Spanish, and Japanese versions all retained the original cover, with the small star at the wrist, no footnote needed. As silence had already spoken clearly, no one was told to use the book. Teachers came across it through emails, printed copies wrapped in paper, or quiet group chats. They read it quickly, then realized its words weren't for students. They were reminders to themselves. One young teacher scrapped his final exam after reading the last chapter, replacing it with a single question: what would you do if the person who disrespected wore your loved one's uniform? The class ended on time, but students stayed, not for grades, but because something in the story held them there. The author remains unnamed, known only as a journalist whose work had been censored for being too sensitive. She chose to release the original story quietly. As interest grew, media outlets reached out with offers. She declined them all. In a rare email reply, she wrote, "This story doesn't need more voices. It needs readers who stay with it." It wasn't for pride or mystery. She simply didn't want pain turned into a media product. She knew how sound bites could twist meaning, so she remained silent, and that silence gave the story more weight, forcing readers to fill the space with their reflection. One student wrote, "You can't read this and react to injustice the same way." A teacher said he saw students argue, not to be right, but to understand. In a quiet classroom, a shy girl pointed to the cover and asked, "Why do some people get believed right away?" The book didn't end with triumph or begin with tragedy. It was a chain of small, quiet truths that, when seen together, showed this: justice is not a decision, but a reflex. And reflexes don't come from slogans. They come from learning to listen before responding. That's why the book, though not official, became the lesson people carried, not to pass a test, but to live better. A major news network extended an invitation, promising not to sensationalize the story and offering full editorial control. The host emphasized it would not be an interview but a space to let the story speak in its own way. She read the letter, stayed silent for several days, then replied with grace. She declined without bitterness, only gratitude. When a story begins to live inside people, it no longer needs my face or voice to prove it's worth believing. Her refusal surprised many. In a world eager to amplify every voice, her quiet no carried rare weight. The host later shared a personal essay, not aired but posted on his blog. He admitted the network saw it as a golden opportunity for ratings. But her response made him question whether interviews were truly about public awareness or about learning when not to ask. "I used to think interviewing was about extracting answers," he wrote. "She made me realize that sometimes silence holds the most truth." His words resonated deeply with others in the media, sparking a wave of reflection. Producers who had once rushed to pitch documentaries began to hesitate. One admitted they received dozens of proposals, but couldn't move forward. Every script tried to retell what was already standing on its own. The woman's power, they realized, wasn't in what she said, but in what she chose not to share. A young writer compared her to the silent notes in music, the pauses that force listeners to breathe and hear deeper meaning. She didn't chase the spotlight, she became the shadow that made others examine their light. People who once sought a symbol of kindness had to confront something harder, that dignity does not always come with a speech. Courage doesn't need a microphone. Sometimes the deepest lesson comes not from presence, but from deliberate absence. A television director even canceled a planned reenactment of the incident, stating, "I thought I would recreate the truth, but her refusal to let me stage anything that was the truth. From someone once handcuffed for suspicion, she walked away from every lens, yet made the entire system look inward." The article that captured this wasn't front-page news. It was written by a freelancer who had witnessed the day at the gas station when the town held its breath. He described her presence, calm, still, unshaken, between two shouting officers and a wary crowd. She didn't need to speak loudly. Her gaze alone made people lower their eyes. Not out of fear, but shame. That silence wasn't empty. In a world racing to speak, she chose not to, and made the system listen another way. Her rejections didn't create a void, they created a shift. People began to act differently. A clerk stopped interrupting. A student helped a bullied classmate. A mother changed how she taught respect. No one spoke on her behalf. They responded in the only way that felt right, through quiet acts born from her silence. The story did not end with a verdict, applause, or any ceremony. It closed with a nameless stone wall, no portrait, no inscription to guide the way. Yet in the main hallway of the Federal Academy, once known for valuing reflex above all in training, people began to pause, not because they were told to, but because something within them recognized this place had witnessed change. Quiet, unannounced, but enough to crack the way the security field saw itself. A young trainee, on his first rotation there, placed his hand on the cold stone, eyes wide with emotion. He whispered, either asking or hoping to hear an echo from that defining afternoon, "She stood here once, didn't she?" No one answered. There was no need. What mattered was no longer the image of a black woman in uniform being handcuffed in broad daylight, but what followed. A system once thought immovable had been forced to relearn how to see people not through uniforms, skin color, or bias, but through the eyes of one human looking at another. His story never had a single main character because the protagonist was always the public's response. A teenager daring to revisit an old memory. An administrative worker chooses to reopen a shelved file. A student wrote, "Silence is not neutral," and thousands who never appeared in the viral clip, but from that point on, began to act differently. She accepted no awards, gave no speeches, and made no media appearances. Yet her silence became the loudest voice. It compelled people to listen, not to understand her, but to understand themselves. And perhaps her most lasting legacy was this. After that day, no one could look at a pair of handcuffs without seeing an entire system questioning itself. This was no longer about who was right or wrong. It became a reminder that power is not the right to react first, but the strength to understand before you act. If you ever believed a story only ends when justice is loudly declared, then you've missed how real change begins. It doesn't live in evening news headlines, isn't etched into medals, and doesn't stand on a podium. It starts when one person refuses to look away and spreads to those who once stayed silent, afraid, convinced they were alone. And when enough people like that stand firm together, society is forced to take a step forward. She never asked to reclaim her dignity. She simply stood her ground as someone unwilling to be defined by the gaze of others. The final bowed head did not belong to her. It belonged to an entire system, a community, a profession that once believed wearing a uniform meant being above fault. She never had to prove anything. Her calm resolve became a mirror for a new generation to relearn that human dignity is not found in badges, but in how we treat the most vulnerable. If you've read this far, ask yourself, the next time you witness something wrong, what will you do? Will you turn away, or will you be the one who makes a system stop just by standing still? Because real change doesn't begin with a scream. It begins when someone, even just one, chooses not to bow their head.